So that brings to the next file backup type, which is called file system backup. We do see this terminology FSB referred to in Velero documentation and other places. It's called file system backup. And what it does is it takes the persistent volume data and it moves that data to the object store. So when many people say backup, without saying anything else, this is what they mean. They mean the backup of the data from persistent volumes offsite, right, to object store or to some other place, something that is not closely tied to either the cluster or the region or the primary storage. And that's what most people mean by the backup, and that's what you really need for a real backups, right? And the way that this is done is Velero uses these two tools. Most of you might already be familiar with this. If not, they are Restrict or Copia. They're independent tools. They're not really tied to Velero in any sense. Even you can use them on your Linux or Mac or Windows to back up your files to object store. So Velero just calls them on a persistent volume, and basically they take the data on persistent volume and put that in the object store. Now, the important thing is to get this functionality, you need to use this option, use node agent. Again, going back to my install command, you're going to see that use node agent, right? You need this option. So when you do this option, Velero is going to install a component called node agent. By the way, I just quickly want to point out that when I use kv command, that means I'm using kube control in Velero namespace. So if you see what is in Velero namespace, you see a daemon set called node agent here. And I have two nodes in this cluster, so you're going to see two parts, node agent parts, right? So you need this node agent for file system backup and even for the other type of the backup that I'm going to talk about. And one of the errors that we see is people forget to install the node agent, and they try to do the file system backup, and they come back and say, oh, Velero is not backing up the PVs. And one of the reasons is that you forget to install the node agent, right? So you need that. And also you can select which tool you want to use. I mean, by default, Velero switch it to using Copia. But for whatever reason, if you have to use Restrict, you can easily select the uploader type option and set Restrict, right? But I do want to mention that the new functionality, more and more functionality is being added in Velero for Copia, right? The Restrict is not seeing new enhancements. So unless you have a genuine reason to stick with Velero, I highly recommend that you just use the default uploader type, which is Copia. And I also want to briefly talk about how these Restrict or Copia work. They have this concept of backup repository, right? This backup repository is created in the object store in your bucket, and that is where all your backups go to. And whenever you run the backup, let's say of some PVs, so these tools are reading the data in the PV, and they're transferring the data to this backup repository only if required. If those blocks are already there in the backup repository, they don't need to transfer that data. So you're getting dedupe out of the box with these tools. And you can, Velero creates one backup repository per namespace. That means you are getting dedupe across the namespace, but I mean, within a namespace, right? But not across namespaces. So that's the design choice that Velero made. So let me quickly show the command here that you can use for, I think Velero has, right? So you can see these backup repositories, and you can see the repository name has the namespace included in that, right? So there's one backup repository, and I'm using Copia in all cases, so that's why you see Copia here, right? Now, so this is important point. Both these tools support dedupe. I briefly described what dedupe does. And again, for dedupe, important point to note is even though the tools transfer only the changed blocks, they still need to read all the data in the file, right? Without reading, they really do not know which data had changed. So if you have a big file with small changes, they still have to read the file and then back up whatever data had changed. I mean, this can probably improve. This will improve once we have a changed block tracking in Kubernetes, and Kubernetes data protection work group is actively working on that as we speak. And they support compression and they support encryption. So all the data in the backup repository is encrypted. And for encryption, Velero is actually going to use a hard-coded password that everybody knows this password because this is hard-coded. And this password is there in a secret called Velero repo credentials, right? So if you see secret here, so you see this secret. And inside the secret, there is a base64 encoded password. But I highly recommend that as soon as you install Velero, you should change that password to something else, right? All you need to do is to basically edit this secret and set the new password in base64 form. But you must do it before you run any backups, before a backup repository is created, right? If you do it after backup repository is created and after doing some backups, and if you change the password, then Velero will not be able to access the repo anymore. So that will lead to trouble. So the recommended practice is install Velero and then immediately change this repo password. Now, let's just talk about how exactly Velero reads the data. That's the important point about file system backup. How does Velero read data? I mean, how does Copia Ristic, right, read the data from the PV? And the answer is the data is read from the live PV. And what do I mean by live PV? This is the same persistent volume that your application is using, is accessing while the backup is actually going on. So there is no separate snapshot or there's no separate PV. It's the same live PV that application is using. And for that reason, if application is active, if application is modifying these files in the PV, your backup may not be consistent, right? In fact, most probably it will be inconsistent, the data. So for that reason, this is a big drawback of the file system backup. And so for this reason, you should use Velero hooks. And again, these are Velero hooks give you a chance to run some commands before backups are done. And you should use that to quiz the application and the disk writes. For example, you can flush the writes. You can, a lot of applications like MySQL and Postgres, for example, they do support what is known as a backup mode, right? That they will reduce the writes in some sense. They will flush the writes to the disk. So you should really use the Velero hooks to do that. And if you don't, and if the application is active, your file system backup data in the object store is going to be inconsistent, and you may run into some kind of problem when you do the restore with the consistency, right? So it's very, very important to understand that data is read from the live PV. And for a very long time, this is the only backup type that Velero supported where the data transfer is done. And that has a big drawback, right? But in 1.12, that problem is addressed, and I want to talk about that now. But before I get to that, again, I'll quickly go back and show the backup that I have for the file system backup. So I have the FS backup, and I will show how do you create the file system backup. And this is how you do it. You pass the option. This is how I do it. I pass the option default volume to FS backup true, right? So if you pass this option to the backup create command, that means that it's a file system backup. So Velero is going to do the file system backup. And let's check what does details show us here. And here you can clearly see that Copia backup's completed, and you're seeing all the volumes that are included in the file system backup, right? I use it Copia. So that's what you will see in the backup descript details.